If you're tired of these promos, supporters get the podcast early and ad-free. Just go to donate.bogosity.tv for the links to sign up. Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the week of April 10, 2022. The podcast that builds automated systems by hand. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's procort the news of the bogus. So Hillary Clinton and the DNC, who subjected us to years of the bogus Trump dossier crap that cost the taxpayers some $40 million, have finally been fined by the FEC for election fraud. The main offense was lying about the funding that was given to the attempt, which violated expenditure reporting rules. They'd failed to disclose that the payments were funneled through their law firm to the opposition research firm Fusion GPS. Fusion GPS was hired by former MI6 agent Christopher Steele to produce his now infamous dossier of completely debunked allegations about Donald Trump's supposed links to the Russian government. A total of over $1 million was paid by the DNC and the Clinton campaign to law firm Perkins Coie, falsely claiming it was for legal services, not opposition research, a clear violation of election law. Neither the campaign nor the party will contest the finding, even though they don't concede to lying. The FEC fined Clinton's treasurer $8,000 and the DNC's $105,000, which seems light, all things considered. The information comes from a memo to the Coolidge-Reagan Foundation, which filed the complaint over 3 years ago. Their attorney, Dan Backer, said, quote, "This may well be the first time that Hillary Clinton, one of the most evidently corrupt politicians in American history, has actually been held legally accountable, and I'm proud to have forced the FEC to do their job for once. The Coolidge-Reagan Foundation proved that, with pluck and grit, Americans who stand with integrity can stand up to the Clinton machine and other corrupt political elites." He, along with the law firm Chalmers and Adams, hopes for further action to be taken, quote, "Hillary Clinton and her cronies willfully engaged in the greatest political fraud in history, destroying our nation's faith in the electoral process, and it's high time they were held accountable. I hope this is only the beginning." He may get his wish. Special counsel John Durham has accused them of withholding hundreds of documents relevant to his investigation. They've refused to hand over the documents, claiming attorney-client privilege, but that's not any kind of excuse when it involves a law firm that's been accused of wrongdoing. Especially since that, out of 1,455 documents, only 18 emails and attachments actually involve an attorney. They also claimed privilege on communications between a Fusion GPS employee and tech executive Rodney Jaffe, even though those documents have nothing to do with the DNC or Hillary's campaign and therefore can't be asserted by them as privileged. As for whether or not Jaffe could assert privilege, that was invalidated because Jaffe, quote, "chose to disclose such information to a third party that did not have any formal or informal contract or retention agreement. And none of it seems to have been related to any legal advice given, which it would have to be privileged." In his 23-page filing, Durham said he wants the documents to be handed over for review by the judge in camera, where any properly privileged documents could be kept out of public view. This comes ahead of the trial of Michael Sussman, attorney for Perkins Coie, for lying to the FBI about his connection to the Clinton campaign when he passed on information about Trump to the FBI, including the easily debunked Alpha Bank conspiracy claim. Hillary Clinton, suspiciously fast, indicating she'd specifically been given the document before it was ready, tweeted out to amplify the conspiracy theory, which was instantly seen to be bogus by anyone with a basic understanding of how DNS works. See the podcast archive for details. Durham said that the purpose behind Fusion GPS's activities, quote, "was to generate opposition research materials that the firm then shared widely with members of the media, the U.S. State Department, the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, members of Congress, and others." Time will tell if the taxpayers and the voters will get any real justice. If you're looking for a way to support this channel, but you don't have any spare cash and you can't stand ads, you can do so by generating your own cryptocurrency. Use the links at the bottom of the description to follow the link to Odyssey.com to listen to the podcast and see all of my YouTube videos as well. Just watching videos will produce cryptocurrency for the creator and yourself. And since Odyssey is always monetized and never censored, you'll have no problem seeing all the videos from your favorite creators. You can also use the library credits you created Odyssey to tip creators and even purchase paid content. Earn library credits through various rewards, including daily view rewards and the number of shares and invites. And you can interact with creators in all sorts of ways, including like and dislike, comment, boost a post by supporting it, repost it, and share to other sites, all while earning crypto for the creator. Easily monetize yourself and your favorite creators using cryptocurrency, without advertising. Use the link below to visit this channel on Odyssey.com and see many of your other favorites there as well. So in the past, we've covered how the gift to the world known as Sci-Hub has been called piracy by big publishing houses, even though scientists and researchers love it. We also covered how ridiculous things have gotten, with anyone and everyone rushing to virtue signal by pulling out of Russia, no matter how much it might hurt the Russian people or even help Putin. 15 major scientific publishers, who together represent almost all the world's scientific journals, have announced that they're suspending all sales and services in Russia. These publications represent 97.5% of the Russian market for scientific publication, with the Russian government providing the rest. Meaning that, for Russians who want access to quality scientific information, Sci-Hub is what they're left with. So if it weren't for Sci-Hub, they'd be left with nothing. It would be the destruction of all science in Russia. It's certainly better than leaving their government as the only source of scientific information. In their statement, they said, quote, "We remain committed to the ideals of science and scholarship as a global community. Our actions are not targeted at Russian researchers, but rather at research organizations in Russia and Belarus." Yeah, except they don't. The ideals of science and scholarship are about open and free access to all scientific data. Of course, if they were all about that, they never would have opposed Sci-Hub in the first place. And the idea that scientific knowledge can be completely shut off to an entire country in an instant is nothing short of frightening. Sci-Hub has always been there for the disenfranchised. No matter how much big publishers refuse to service their areas, or how much their governments work to keep scientific findings out, if you can just get access to the internet, Sci-Hub is there. In this case, though, it'll be difficult, since Springer Nature, one of the 15 publications, had previously petitioned the Moscow court to block the site by all major ISPs. And every time Sci-Hub gets a new domain, Roskomnadzor, a division of the Ministry of Digital Development, Communications, and Mass Media, blocks them and orders Google to remove them from search results. Roskomnadzor, by the way, is also blocking all sites that don't publish official government propaganda about the war. Not that there aren't a bunch of ways around the blocks, but any restrictions on the access to knowledge is ultimately destructive of a society. So if this is really about acting against the Russian government instead of an act of ethnic isolation of its people, they're doing it wrong. And it's also never the way to have peace, assuming they want that too. If you're on the Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, anyone on that network can get your traffic. Do you really trust all of those strangers? For that matter, do you really trust your ISP? A VPN can protect you from prying eyes, disguise your location, and even foil government censors. It's essential in this day and age, so go to vpn.bogosity.tv and you'll be taken to BoxPN. Starting at just $2.99 a month, you can get unlimited high-speed connections to VPN servers all over the world, and they don't log connections, so your privacy is assured. Traveling abroad, just VPN home, and don't worry about what those other governments are doing. Back at home, stop your ISP from traffic shaping and messing with the quality internet access you're paying good money for. You can connect from multiple machines at once, including your smartphone or tablet, and it supports all the secure standards, including OpenVPN and SSTP. Bypass sensors and surveillance with your own secure VPN connection. Go to vpn.bogosity.tv. And now a bit of good news. The first acquittal of the January 6 protesters. The protesters, almost to the person, were making their voices heard peacefully and committed nothing more than misdemeanor trespass and were arrested in completely political prosecutions. Additionally, most of them have been completely denied bail and have spent more than a year in pre-trial detention for a misdemeanor that would only give them 6 months to a year if convicted. They say the process is half the punishment, but in this case it seems to be more than 130% of the punishment. Now, after a 2-day bench trial, Los Alamos-based Energy Department contractor Matthew Martin has just been acquitted for his role in this hideous, violent insurrection that came just that close to toppling our great democracy. Yes, I said that with a straight face. Are you proud of me? U.S. District Judge Trevor N. McFadden found him not guilty of trespassing and disorderly conduct, both misdemeanors, saying that the defendant's argument that police allowed him into the building was plausible, therefore constitutes reasonable doubt. Although his verdict isn't binding on any other cases, it may encourage other defendants to contest their charges. So far, 150 people have pleaded to misdemeanor accounts, including entering or remaining in restricted areas, as well as illegal picketing, parading, or demonstrating, which should not be crimes according to anyone who's actually read the First Amendment. Martin, testifying in his own defense, said he'd never visited the Capitol before and didn't know what was off limits to protesters. McFadden ruled that, while protesters showed that he, quote, more likely than not knew he was not supposed to go in, the fact that Capitol Police waved him and others in created reasonable doubt. Understatement of the decade! Generally, if it seems like a police officer wants you to do something, most people might feel compelled to actually do it. They have guns, you know. And certainly it seems ridiculous that you could be arrested and charged for following the requests of an officer. The verdict was based on extensive video evidence, much of it provided by Martin himself in the form of video he shot on his cell phone. Prosecutors claimed that Martin had to have passed barricades of bike racks and plastic fencing with area closed signs. They also claimed that Martin's behavior was that of guilt. That night, his supervisor texted him an admonishment saying, quote, "You can't overrun the Capitol building." Martin replied, "Actually, you can. Rather easily, I might add. Not as much security as you might think. Our numbers were freaking huge. They were not prepared." Martin testified that his actions were peaceful and that he had committed no violence or vandalism. He had crossed no barricades and assumed that the area closed signs applied only to other portions of the Capitol grounds since they weren't in his way. He also had no way of knowing that none of the other masses of people weren't allowed there. The judge pointed out that the count of trespassing, quote, is a close call, but under our system of justice, close calls go to the defendant. He pointed out that Martin waited his turn in line, recorded everything, and left when riot police cleared the rotunda. As for the disorderly conduct count, quote, no reasonable juror could find these actions to be disorderly. I don't find his mere presence in a crowd outside the Capitol to be disorderly. He said Martin's actions were minimal and nonviolent. He didn't shout or raise his flag, and mostly spent his time at the back of the crowd shooting video. In that, he was behaving much like members of the news media. Martin, who has top secret clearance, lost his job at Los Alamos, so we'll see if justice means anything there and he gets it back. Of course, the media is screeching about how it's a biased judge and this wasn't a real trial because it didn't go to a jury. There are several things to keep in mind. First, jury trials are there for the sake of the defendant. The reason why we generally don't like bench trials and assert the right of trial by jury is that judges tend to be biased towards the prosecution. Second, not only did the defendant have to request a bench trial, the prosecution had to sign off on it, and they wouldn't have done that if they thought they could prevail in front of a jury. especially in D.C., where the jury members would almost all be anti-Trump liberals. Third, despite allegations of bias based on the fact that McFadden is a Trump appointee, he's also a former police officer and previously convicted Coy Griffin of Cowboys for Trump of misdemeanor trespass at his bench trial on the basis that Griffin actually climbed over 3 walls to get in, meaning that he knew he shouldn't have been there. A better question would be, if this was all insurrection and domestic terrorism and violent extremism and a danger to democracy and all sorts of mean, nasty, ugly things, so much so that it needs all this money and all this political power to oppose, why do prosecutors keep reducing the charges to misdemeanors and agreeing to bench trials? And with the overwhelming majority of the cases being dropped to misdemeanors and some even being acquitted outright, I'll take a question from my generation, where's the beef, and ask, where's the insurrection?
Do you have children, or nieces or nephews? Are you homeschooling, or just want to counter some of the socialist indoctrination most children get in school? If so, go to Bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins, and you'll be taken to a website where you can get some great books for elementary-aged children. The Tuttle Twins books are books about liberty and free market economics that include children's versions of Bastiat's The Law, Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, as well as books about the Federal Reserve and how regulations protect business cronies. They'll learn about the harm caused by eminent domain, or regulations passed in the name of safety, and fundamental concepts of liberty. And as you can see from the sample pages on the website, they're all easy to read and nicely illustrated. They're just $9.99 a piece, or get a special discount as well as free bonuses when you purchase all 5. You can even buy in bulk to donate to schools and local libraries. So get the Tuttle Twins books at Bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins.
And now it's time to sub-amplify this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And this week it goes to international music cartel IPFI for listing one of the latest threats of piracy as, get this, Discord. The European Commission, ever at the behest of corporate interests over the people, put together the Counterfeit and Piracy Watch List where stakeholder groups, i.e. cronies, can nominate sites and services for inclusion. One of them is IPFI, which represents some 8,000 music companies worldwide. They submitted a 36-page document that begins with a screed about how much piracy harms the music industry, which, as we've demonstrated several times over the history of this podcast, it doesn't. But it does represent harm to them by enabling people to compete with them, which is why they've gone after YouTube rippers, cyberlockers, direct download sites, and torrent sites. And now, they're going after lesser-used social media platforms like Discord, Reddit, and Telegram. They wrote, although there are huge numbers of services that infringe our members' rights due to the grave economic harm caused by pre-release piracy, the services mentioned above, Discord, Reddit, and Telegram, are considered enforcement priorities for the music industry and are a particular focus in this submission. They also mention cyberlockers such as Debris and OnlyFiles, since they don't respond to takedown requests. Even the ones that do, they say, should do more, but as we've seen, nothing will satisfy them. Except perhaps for absolute exclusivity and the banning of all alternative artists. Discord, they say, is a big problem because many servers are private and people can share music in a way that they don't approve of. Quote, most notably and problematically for the music industry, Discord has rapidly become an underground marketplace for the distribution and crowdfunding of stolen, unreleased, or pre-released content through so-called group buys. This is where users use a Discord server to operate an auction to sell unreleased or pre-released content. They also wrote, users on a free subscription are offered the ability to join up to 100 servers and upload files up to 8 megabytes. The typical song is about 5 megabytes, depending on the quality of the recording and the bitrate of the encoding. Yeah, well, it's also used as a platform for alternative artists to share their work with their fans. In particular, they complain about, quote, the ability for users to set up private servers, the ability for operators of the server to remain anonymous, and the ease of using bots on the servers, which can perform tasks assigned to it by an admin user. So basically, because the platform is actually usable. I guess they want to force us all to go back to IRC. Although if there's money and power in it, they might find a way to complain about that too. They also made a lot of complaints about Reddit. Quote, we have detected many instances of pre-release content distributed across the platform, including on leak-specific subreddits. Reddit, in all caps for some odd reason, is used in combination with other services such as Discord and Twitter to promote the distribution of pre-release content. Reddit responds to takedown requests and has a repeat infringer policy. Last year alone, it permanently banned 2,813 users and 2,625 subreddits. Not good enough, apparently. Yes, they want them to take, quote, proactive steps to prevent piracy. And we all know what that means, right, kids? They even want these proactive steps to be taken by Twitter, as if there's not enough censorship on that site. Quote, Twitter still does not take steps to prevent future infringements of content that has been notified. Consequently, IPFI and its member companies spend a significant amount of time and resources identifying and notifying reappearances of the same content. Wait, you mean you actually have to show that there's pirated content before they'll take it down? Oh, poor widow baby! So, in case it isn't clear, once again they're demanding upload filters. They won't come out and say that because admitting it would be all kinds of bad, but it's the only way to meet their demands. While conduit protections basically don't exist anywhere for copyrighted content, in the US and many other countries there is safe harbor for sites that respond to takedown requests. But again, that's just not good enough. Quote, they have to modify their EU-facing operations and either get licensed for the music content made available on their platforms, in other words, pay them money, or ensure that no such unlicensed content is available there. In other words, install filters. And just in case you think I've been overstating how horrible they are, quote, while Europe led the way in providing this clarification, it is evident that many services, notably some based in the US, often view their obligations as limited to compliance with US safe harbor laws and not the new EU standards of protection. Wow, you mean they think they only have to obey the laws where they live? The fiends! So if you run any sort of site or server, the message is, shut up and do the impossible, and you'd better do it fast enough for them. So all of that makes IPFI this week's biggest Bogon emitter.
I want to tell you about the eyeglasses I've been wearing for years. As people can see on my videos, I have a very strong prescription, which makes glasses more expensive, especially when I need computer glasses, reading glasses, prescription sunglasses, and most expensively, progressive lenses for general everyday wear. To save money while still getting quality glasses, I get them from Firmoo. In fact, I just got a pair of progressives with high-index aspherical lenses and a nice pair of frames my wife loves for just over $100. It would have been $500 to get them through my eye doctor. Not only do they look good, the glasses are durable. I've worn many pairs for several years without problems. All orders come with a 30-day return policy, a 3-month warranty, and one-on-one customer service. Go to Firmoo, that's FIRMOO.Bogosity.tv anytime you need quality glasses at a low price. Once again, that's Firmoo.Bogosity.tv.
And now let's psycho-rectify this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.
You know, I would think that when all of the eyes of the world are upon you, that's the point where you'd at least want to pretend to be a decent human being and not make it obvious you're every bit the chumped up totalitarian dictator your enemies say you are. But then, I ain't Vladimir Putin. He's made threats to fine Wikipedia up to 4 million rubles, about $50,000, if they don't remove, quote, unreliable socially significant information. In other words, censorship, baby! The Wikimedia Foundation hasn't yet responded to this latest demand, but a month ago they wrote, the Wikimedia Foundation and the movement we are a part of have never backed down in the face of government threats to deny people their fundamental human right to access free, open, and verifiable information. We will not back down in the face of efforts to censor and intimidate members of our movement. We stand by our mission to deliver free knowledge to the world. It apparently hasn't occurred to Putin to try editing Wikipedia to put in true information. Of course, he'd have to demonstrate that it's true. Even before this latest round of fighting, Russia already had a strict censorship regime. Since then, it's only been tightened. Previously, Putin signed into law a prohibition of fake news with penalties of up to 15 years in prison. In fact, in a move reminiscent of the U.S. calling Korea and Vietnam police actions instead of war, they're not allowed to call the Russo-Ukrainian War a war or an invasion. It's a special military operation. They've also blocked Facebook, Twitter, and a number of Western news outlets. Others, as we've covered, have happily censored themselves. They just call it a boycott, one that absolutely gives Putin what he wants. I don't think they really got the idea of what a boycott's all about. Last week, Roskomnadzor told Wikipedia to stop, quote, misinforming Russian users. And on Tuesday said, quote, Wikipedia has become a new line of constant information attacks on Russians. They also wrote, the authors of articles posted on Wikipedia deliberately misinform users of the internet resource with false information. I mean, they're not wrong, at least in some cases, but you do not make that illegal or otherwise suppress it. You counter lies by telling the truth. Suppression, censorship, and silencing is what you do when you don't want the truth to be told. Granted, it's often hard to know what that is, especially in the fog of war. We've seen tons of reports that are exaggerated or outright false, and even videos that are misleading or that aren't even from Ukraine. Putin has also made threats against YouTube, which is one of the few Western platforms still operating in Russia, after they took down a number of Russian channels, including ones belonging to RT. I guess it's just like we've seen over the history of this podcast. So many people who want to spew misinformation about others all of a sudden become champions of truth as soon as others give misinformation about them. So all of that makes Vladimir Putin this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this treacherous, malicious, unprincipled cad, preferably non-smoker, wanted to be king of Sardinia edition of the Bogosity podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go to donate.bogosity.tv for several ways to support and discord.bogosity.tv to join the discussion. Subscribe at Patreon or Subscribestar, and you can listen early and ad-free. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Harry Browne. It is well known that in war, the first casualty is truth, that during any war, truth is forsaken for propaganda. But sanity was a prior casualty. It was the loss of sanity that led to war in the first place. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.
Bogosity.
We live in a world where light bulbs connect to the internet, and recent attacks on them prove that your online security is under threat like never before. Not only your websites, but the internet-enabled devices you buy. And the biggest problem is weak passwords. That's why you need LastPass. LastPass allows you to randomly generate strong, unique passwords on the web and on your internet-enabled devices, all protected by one master password. LastPass sets up in minutes and gives you secure automatic logins throughout the web, synchronizing across all your browsers, all your computers, and even your mobile devices, at home, at work, or on the road. It even securely stores sensitive form data, including credit card numbers, backup sensitive documents, software licenses, Wi-Fi logins, and more. And with LastPass Premium, you can get these benefits on other applications, manage passwords for your entire family, and also get priority customer support. Sign up at password.bogosity.tv for a free month of LastPass Premium. Log in securely everywhere using the last password you'll ever have to remember. Go to password.bogosity.tv and get LastPass now.